You're listening to Roleplay Geeks, July 13th, 2020. Stab the monster. Lightning bolt, magic missile. Stab the monster. Loot the body. Check for secret doors. Check for traps. Open the next door. Stab the monster. That's right. We're talking about dungeon crawls. Everyone's favorite type of gaming to hate and love. It's where everyone starts, so we spend some time trying to look up and decide what a dungeon crawl actually is. We spend some time talking about the roots of dungeon crawls and wargaming, and we talk about the 80s hit arcade game Gauntlet and use that as a sort of cultural reference. On top of that, Jim is a goldfish. Hello, welcome to Roleplay Geeks. I'm Frank.
I'm your token hippie, John.
And it's Jim again. Jesus Christ!
Well,
go again.
The way you said it, no, there's no going again. This is Steve. This is Steve.
It's the same way every week, man. And this is Steve-O, a.k.a. the other Steve.
In this week's episode, we're going to talk a little bit about sort of the great granddaddy, I think where most people start with their role-playing experience, which is the dungeon crawl. Now, it's a fairly simple idea, I think, that has a lot of depth, and we're going to talk a little bit about it. It can have a lot of depth, which is essentially you as a series of characters or party, you enter into a dungeon of some sort. It doesn't have to be a dungeon. It could be a cave system. It could be a number of things. And you have a subsequent series of adventures, interactions, encounters with various monsters in which you, let's be honest, most of us are murder hobos, so basically you kill them and then you take their stuff and then you move on to the next thing. And that's effectively a very simplistic definition of a dungeon crawl. So I thought we'd talk a little bit today about our experiences with them, how they got started, why we all start there, how we can make them better, our favorite dungeon crawls, all that sort of stuff. So let's start off with that. That was the definition I gave for dungeon crawl. Does anyone have any things they like to embellish or ways they like to think about it differently or something I left out?
According to Wikipedia, a dungeon crawl is a type of scenario in fantasy role-playing games in which heroes navigate a labyrinth environment, aka dungeon, battling various monsters, avoiding traps, solving puzzles, and looting any treasure they may find.
Oh, there we go. Show's over. See you guys next week.
Bye.
Well, yeah, that certainly defines what we mean by dungeon crawl, right? And, there's two parts to it. Obviously, the dungeon, which is a labyrinth. It doesn't have to be a dungeon, though that's very typical. Like I said, a cave system is another example. An ancient temple, ruins, any number of these things. Do you think a dungeon crawl requires underground?
No. I guess
really.
not.
I don't think it requires it, but it almost invariably ends up there.
That's
Yeah,
the way
can you
I
think
think
of
about it. Yeah.
You could have an open-air maze. Ta-da!
But can you think of a dungeon crawl you've ever been on that was above ground?
Probably some type of science fiction where you're exploring and derelict spacecraft would be very similar to a dungeon crawl. You don't know what you're getting into. Creepy, dark, and as you progress, there'll be various obstacles, encounters, opponents, that sort of thing, and maybe puzzles to figure out along the way.
So that's actually kind of an interesting thought, because normally when we think about dungeon crawls, and I think part of it's because of the word dungeon, we tend to think of fantasy, right? We don't tend to think that science fiction lends itself to a dungeon crawl, but until you just said that, it never occurred to me. Yeah, that's kind of some of what we do. It's an element of, it can be an element of science fiction. We keep referencing this, the Traveler campaign that Jimmy has been running through, but a big chunk of that was a dungeon crawl, if you think about it.
I guess it depends on how you define it. I mean, I know how it's defined by Wikipedia, but I sort of have my own bent on it, just based on how I started role-playing. So when I started role-playing before I actually started Dungeons & Dragons, it was Billy and I with graph paper before we knew about Dungeons & Dragons. And it was based off of those old books that you would get, choose your own adventure, And as you'd go through the book, it'd say, do you want to do this, X, Y, or Z? And then you would go to a different page of the book. And that would tell a different story every time you'd go through it. So we sort of Billy started that with graph paper, and, you'd go down a hallway and you'd go left or right. We didn't have any classes or anything like that. It was mainly just riddles and traps. And then from there, we went into Dungeons and Dragons once we learned about it from his brother. And that added another level of complexity to it. But we took that idea of the graph paper and going through dungeons and just moved it over into, the Dungeons and Dragons. So every game we played from that point forward was all based on this idea of a dungeon crawl. And it wasn't until later when I met you guys that I started doing more of the really Steve-O, when I started doing more of the role-playing aspect, the more sophisticated, what I view as a sophisticated approach to role-playing. So in that sense, I always think about it requires graph paper. I know that's not true, but it's that wargaming aspect that came out of the Blackmore stuff that Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson did in the early days.
Oh, don't forget your scones and Earl Grey tea. Yeah, the sophistication, of course.
But, yeah, I mean, absolutely. I know the early days, as you're talking about, when I first got into Dungeons & Dragons, I mean, literally the only thing that was out there was the box set. And they almost all shipped with B2, the Keep on the Borderlands, which is still, the classic module to start with. But then after you're done, you've run it all. There was one other module, or a couple other modules, but in my town we didn't have a game shop or anything, pre-internet days. So, I mean, it was implied in the rules and in every role-playing game that you would create your own adventures and populate them with monsters. And I think it was only natural to say, hey, I've got a cave full of goblins and stuff, and then, and that's exactly what we did. We used graph paper, and in every small square represented a 10 by 10 area. And so you'd make these 10 by 10 tunnels and then branch them out into rooms, and they would all be perfectly square, and then populate them with things. And, to me, even to this day, that's still what a dungeon crawl is. And then, of course, those early days, I don't know how, everyone's learning how to play the game. So you're going through the monster section of that basic book, or later on you get the monster manual and you just start finding creative creatures to stick in there to surprise your players with. And then at the end, I guess there will always be some boss battle and a bunch of loot. So that's kind of how they all transpired. It would usually be a village being terrorized by something that lived in a cave, and you were commissioned to go wipe it out.
Because he couldn't build a proper house. He had to live in a cave.
Yeah, whatever. I mean, that was how, I guess, 90% of our adventures went while I was in high school. So, then we started getting a little more creative and decided that maybe we need a little story here besides, we all meet in a bar and some guy says, hey, there's a cave up on the hill full of goblins.
So it's a slightly different version, Jimmy's definition, which I think has a lot of validity. The notion that it's very much tied to the map. That the map, whether it's something you're created as you're going along, whether you even bother to draw it yourself, or it's something in the GM's hand or even mind, that there is an implicit map or explicit map that allows you to explore it in the confines of that space.
Well, and in those days, one thing I failed to mention was the DM would actually describe how far you would have to go on your map. Okay, you go 30 feet, to the west, and it's a 10 by 10, and so somebody would be the mapper. One of the players would actually sit there and literally draw it out, and they would look at the map. So I had a game master once that actually made a sword out of what you drew on the map. Like, this was what we were exploring, the dungeon, but then when you finished it all up, it made a sword. He thought that was a neat thing, so you'd start actually constructing a picture in front of you as you explored the cave. But mapping was a big deal probably for a good 2-3 years that we played, we would always have somebody as the mapper. It wasn't only until a few years after that, I just did away with that whole thing. I was just like, it takes too much time. It's really not important.
Let's talk about the other part of it, the crawl part of it, right? We sort of, I think, fairly well defined the dungeon as being a labyrinth, as being a very map-based labyrinth, usually, but the crawl part of it. So there's nothing inherently wrong with a labyrinth. There's nothing inherently wrong with a map-based thing. That in of itself probably isn't sufficient to construct a dungeon crawl. The crawl, I think, is equally, if not more so, important. So how do you guys think about a crawl? Like, what defines a crawl as it's just a series, as just an encounter? So I mentioned that in Jimmy's Traveler campaign, that part of what his campaign was you could define as a dungeon crawl. And I think it's hard to, you can't tell this because it's an audio medium, but I think visually he bristled a little bit at that descriptor, because I suspect he doesn't necessarily think of that section of his game as a dungeon crawl per se.
Oh, I do definitely. So
okay, so I'm wrong about that.
Well, dungeon
He doesn't
crawl.
have enough hair on his head to bristle anyway. So.
Yeah, sure. Fair enough.
So dungeon crawl, I think, was the first time that came around was I have the issue over here on my bookshelf. I think it's like 112 or 111 or something like that of Dragon Magazine. Gary Gygax talks about that Blackmore stuff, and he calls it a dungeon crawl. And I think he mentions in that article where he referenced it because of pub crawls. So oftentimes I feel like with you guys, my games are a lot like a pub crawl, where half of you are drunk and the other half are on their way to getting there. And so, yeah, it feels like a crawl to me sometimes as a game master, because I don't know what the hell you guys are doing.
Well, I think the idea of crawl is that the progression is very slow.
Yeah.
Because
for
every
sure.
room you go to, it's going to be combat heavy.
Yeah.
So
Or
to
puzzle
me,
heavy.
that's the definition. Yeah. I mean, typically though, your typical dungeon crawl, quote, air quotes, is you go in one room, you kill everything there, you search, and then you go to the next room and start killing everything there. And in a game like Dungeons and Dragons, the combat can take a while. So that's why, in my mind, I consider it a dungeon crawl, because it just takes you a long time to get anywhere.
For sure.
Which is fine, if
Well,
that's what you like.
If that's what you like. It's more like a board game at that point than a role-playing game.
Can
Like
be.
a war game. Tabletop.
So, okay, that teases that question, is that why is that less role-playing and more board gaming?
Because you're really not role-playing per se. I mean, you're not...
Well, you're kind of...
Well, I mean,
You're kind of playing the
are
role
to an
of
extent.
murder hobo, right?
Right. Well, I guess so.
I gotta know where that
wouldn't
term
really be
came
playing
from.
a role for me, but I think the fact that you're generally you're not interacting with other characters. I mean, besides your own party, you're not doing anything besides this. I mean, it's really roll heavy is the best, or rolling dice heavy is what I should say. Because generally all you're doing
OLL.
is either rolling for, combat, or rolling to search for secret doors, rolling to look for treasure. About the only thing that you're doing that involves you as a player doing much other than very simple decisions is maybe trying to work out puzzles or riddles.
I think you're thinking of role playing as being interacting with NPCs. I think there's more to it. I mean, for one thing, especially Dungeons and Dragons, which has specialized classes, I'm the cleric, I'm the wizard, I'm the fighter, and you choose those classes. So typically the fighter steps out front and becomes the meat shield, and while everybody else waves their hands and tries to cast spells. So I mean that's part of role playing too.
True.
To me.
True. I'm not saying that's the only part of it and stuff, but I think it kind of loses something. But maybe that's just my own, personal bent on it.
I think I know what you mean, though. I mean, I get where you're going with that, because there's so much time in between waiting for all the combat to be resolved and stuff. There's a lot of downtime in combat.
It's a spectrum, right? So it's it's gradation. So on one end, you have like a board game where you're rolling dice and moving your tokens around. And on the other end, you have just acting out these scenarios or events as your character. So those are the two extremes, LARPing on one end and then a board game on the other end. And the dungeon crawl falls closer to that wargaming aspect. And we're doing it a little bit now with Fantasy Grounds, but I'd be more interested because there was a time where I stopped doing that when I started playing with Steve-O. And so I never really did the miniatures all that much, if at all. I don't know that any of us did, other than maybe Steven, who probably did some of that wargaming style stuff, I think, because when we did it with Todd, that was the first time I'd really done sort of like the tabletop wargaming rule set. And I'd be really interested to know what Steve-O's take was on that, like the tabletop approach to it, because we're doing it with Fantasy Grounds. That's a whole different thing just because of the automation built into it, which makes it a little bit more enjoyable. But I didn't enjoy that time with Todd. I don't know what Steve-O thought about it for that time period.
You mean Steven?
Steven. Yeah, I get you guys mixed up. You look so much alike.
Too bad we're not on a visual medium. I'm so much better looking.
Yeah, you were saying Steve-O and Todd, and I was like, wow, Todd, the other Todd played
Yeah.
games with Steve-O.
Okay,
The other Todd.
So I basically tuned you out that complete thing you just said. So
Hey, that's Jimmy's job.
Yeah, I'm supposed to be the tuned out one.
yeah, but he tunes things out because, he's a goldfish, and I tuned it out because I didn't think it was me.
No,
There's a difference.
you tune things out because you're a literal semanticist. So basically, the implication of the word jumble is clearly that you don't need to pay attention.
Yes.
When in reality, you need to get beyond the semantics into what, particularly if you're talking about Jimmy, what the intent is. He was saying Steve-O, but we knew he meant Steven.
Steven, because you're the one who knew Todd, who was the
but I didn't.
tabletop gaming guy.
Hey, Todd's mom came up earlier, and so it seemed like a natural progression that he came up again.
Well,
and
the
there was
other
this
Todd.
role-playing thing that I didn't know about.
Okay, so we've
There
digressed
really
a
is
little bit to
another-
personal interaction here a bit. So let's get back to the question at hand, which is, Jimmy's asking about, Steven, your experiences with more the miniatures-based, more what he calls tabletop or board game towards that end of the spectrum of role-playing.
Does it make it
So there-
more enjoyable, Steven, to play it that way than using graph paper? And yeah, so that's one question. And the other is, do you like it? What's good about it, if anything?
I like having a dedicated space where you can have a representation of where you are in relation to objects and the world. So the whiteboarding on the table where we can draw it like a giant piece of graph paper and then have objects on the board that show us relative in space. I like that. I believe that helps visualize things, whether it is combat or whether it is a certain situation, whether it be a town you're in or a room you're in relation to other people and objects within that room. There was another definition on Reddit that says, in an RPG, the players along with the DM work together to make a story. In a dungeon crawl, the players play towards achieving an objective, usually clearing a dungeon and defeating some dark lord. So I thought, the more we talked about it, I was looking through at video games they consider to be dungeon crawls, and in that they included The Bard's Tale, which they put it right next to Gauntlet. And they are very, very different games, especially as The Bard's Tale progressed in its series and it became more complicated, and the puzzles and the things you had to interact with. And your characters leveled and they grew. So in that particular sense, I never thought of Bard's Tale and some of these other video games that are RPGs as being dungeon crawls, that other people are kind of putting them in that category. So this Reddit definition makes a little more sense, that there's a static element to it. There is a set in stone element to it. Just about any module could be considered a dungeon crawl. It's predetermined. You have a predetermined destination and you have to get through so many obstacles to get there. Whereas another style of role-playing game, and you go to the extreme of LARPing, then those adventures are very organic and they morph over time and they become something greater than the journey that you're on to get to the destination. So I don't know. I almost think that dungeon crawl should really be limited to, it's on rails. Something that's on rails that doesn't have a lot of creativity, where you don't have a lot of growth and you don't have a lot of interaction. So
Dungeons and Dragons.
The thing with the miniatures is, even with something that's on rails, like what we're doing, playing Fantasy Grounds with Andrew and learning that, delivery system and learning how to interact within it, even within the confines of combat after room after combat after room, within that, we've at least started to develop very particular characters with their own traits. So within the party itself...
You're talking about how you run away all the time and don't hit anybody? I'm just curious.
He actually ends up on the floor a lot of the times.
Yeah.
Both of our paladins do.
I'm like over here bleeding to death. Man, how about a heal, dude? Well,
you get your heal. Are you dead yet?
Yeah.
You are not dead yet. No one is dead yet. You don't have to heal someone immediately.
You have a broom.
I look at it.
So, okay.
Just
I
fly
have
over
a broom.
to him
I
and
can
heal him.
fly away anytime I want. No, I can't fly over to heal him because then I got to reach down. I'm not Harry Potter. I'm not like, wee. I'm a paladin in full armor on a witch's broom. I don't exactly have maneuverability.
Okay, so let's. So your definition of dungeon crawl, Stephen, if I may summarize, is that it's an adventure where there's no growth, no possibility for growth, and you're traveling from point A to point B, even if you don't know what point B is.
And it's repetitive.
It's repetitive. Okay, so it's a much more narrow definition of dungeon crawl, I think. And it's a little more nuanced, if you ask me. But that would suggest that there are very few actual dungeon crawls, wouldn't
it? I'm sorry. John's making faces at me. I didn't hear what you were saying because he keeps making faces.
I wasn't talking to you, so who cares if you... I saw you cracking up, so I was like, I'm just going to ignore him. This is mostly for Steve.
It was John.
Because he threw it out... Well, it's fine. He threw it out there, this notion that he came up with a different definition of dungeon crawl, and I'm asking, doesn't that kind of automatically limit dungeon crawls to be a very narrow band of actual adventures? Or am I missing something in your definition?
I don't know. I think to an extent it actually might kind of increase the definition, really, or encompass more. I think when you get down to it, if you have what you guys, there's, you hear rumblings of, in the inns and taverns about some horrible, mage in the east who's doing something and blah, 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 and instead you're not in a dungeon, but you're going from town to town and encounter to encounter to finally confront said big bad guy in a tower somewhere. And so going by the definition, that the previous definition that Stephen had gone through, then more, these things actually kind of encompass the dungeon crawl.
Well, let me throw one out there then. Okay, if we're trying to define dungeon crawl, what is not a dungeon crawl then? What is the alternative?
Yeah, see, this is where I would argue that, for example, to reference Jimmy's Traveler campaign, the elements that you could think of as a dungeon crawl are kind of micro elements that were critical to the plot, to the story. So yes, we went on a space station. Yes, we crawled through it and things were revealed and it was kind of spooky and all that stuff. But it had an important point, an important part, a role, if you will, in the plot, and that would make it not a dungeon crawl, even if in the micro sense that little bit was crawl-y. So I think that a dungeon crawl, whether you use what I think is a little more narrow definition of Steven's definition, or even the greater one we started with, it has to be the sum of the campaign. It's nothing more than, it's never anything more than this.
Right.
That would be an important part to dungeon crawls for me.
That would be like Gauntlet.
Exactly.
Right, exactly. It's never going to be more than that.
I don't know what that is.
I can get behind
May
that.
want to elaborate a little bit.
Gauntlet's a video game that was from the 80s that basically you played one of four characters.
It required a ton of quarters.
Right. And you just killed monsters and moved to the next level.
Red Fighter needs food badly. So
We bought some geeky programmer a really nice house somewhere.
exactly.
I think I kind of remember that now. Yeah, the food thing.
Green elf.
So, Steven, you were going to
food
say
badly.
Pardon me.
Yellow wizard.
Yeah, I was going to clear my throat. I
Blue
was going to say
Amazon.
Valkyrie.
Valkyrie, that's it. Oh my
No.
god, yeah.
Right.
Completely wrong.
Right.
Oh my god.
That was
Right.
my favorite character.
Yeah, because they were pretty powerful actually, and then also had some other pretty good spells.
Was that what you
Well,
played?
they were a nice mix of sort of like a magic user and sort of like a fighter. So they had a little bit of,
And it had a little
more
bit of the
defense.
speed of the elf.
Steven
Yeah,
was a
so-
wizard, right?
They were actually really a pretty bad.
Yeah, it was a wizard named Rasslin all the time, 100%. Even if it wasn't explicit on the game, it was.
It's like
you
we're
know,
playing
implicit.
Traveler and Steven's going to be wrestling the wizard.
Right, exactly.
Hey, guess what? Youngest daughter just started reading the Dragonlance series,
I'm so
and I
sorry.
said, "Hey, I said, when you read it, I want you to think of the character that I like the most." And she says, I don't know, Tanis? And I was like, for God's sakes, no, not Tanis. And she's like, why? He seems like he's pretty even-headed, and he knows what's going on, and he's nice. And I was like, no. And she said, Caramon? Because he's big? I was like, no, he's stupid. He's got a good heart, but he's dumb. He's,
That sounds right.
And she's
Sounds
like,
right.
she's like the knight. I was
So
like,
she just
Storm?
went through
No,
them all, is what you're
I'm not-
saying.
She went through every one of them except for Tika and Gold Moon. And I was like, no, Rastlin, however you want to pronounce it. And she just looked at me with horror. And she's like, what? Why? Why him? And I'm like, what do you mean, why him? He's awesome. And she's like, he's terrible.
Yeah,
He's mean. He's an awful person. And I was like, well, it was junior high.
Okay, so again, we're going a little bit of a tangent here, but I think Steve-O did put a really intriguing question on the table that we should work through a little bit, which is, what isn't a dungeon crawl? What's a good example of something that isn't a good dungeon crawl? Or what
LARPing.
elements... Well, okay, so let's see if we can define this without defining nothing more than the far extremes. Because essentially, if you're just creating 2 points on the line and saying it's a spectrum, it doesn't really define anything, does it? As long as you're not A or B, anything is anything, except A or B. So let's see if we can narrow down that spectrum a bit more and talk about bands of spectrum as opposed to just the endpoints.
Well,
Okay,
all right.
so we can.
Oh my
so
God,
we.
the cacophony of answers.
I was just waiting for somebody else to talk. I always feel like I talk too much in these things. I got plenty to say. So.
Well, okay, so I think that let's talk about a one dimension that Stephen raised, which is the notion of on rails. So I think that part of what doesn't constitute a dungeon crawl is that the players have some autonomy to determine the story at some level. And I think as GMs, we tend to think, well, yeah, they always do. But a lot of times they don't really. I mean, how much of the story are we really impacting in Andrew's campaign, for example?
Right. Well, I think for me, the adventures, and I've talked about this sort of thing before, but typically if there's a problem, and I'll go to our Call of Cthulhu campaign because that's the most recent one I ran. There was, a creature in the area that was creating issues, and there were some other things, that were creating issues for the town, but there were some other things going on as well that were related, of course, I had everyone meet at one place, and that's where the adventure began. But then after that, I'd throw some things out there, and you guys made the decisions of where to go. And in a way, I had to give you ideas of what to do and where to go and what to explore. But there were other times in the adventure when you guys would come up with an idea to explore or investigate something, and I did that on the fly. So that definitely wasn't on the rails. And those are my favorite kind of adventures, where there's something there, some whatever, let's say evil, put it in a fantasy sense, but there's some evil thing or a group of evil things with some type of objective, and then you guys, the characters and players, need to overcome that. And how you go about it is very much up to you, even though I have a framework set there. Like, this is what... To me, I try to have the, let's just say, adversaries with their own goals and objectives. And I have them kind of working in the background and in my mind of what they're doing. And then you guys have to try and figure that out. And sometimes I have to throw bigger clues than others just to keep the game going. But then combat and things like that can erupt in a street or anywhere. And I did have a tunnel exploration area in this map. But I don't know that I would call that a dungeon crawl, because every piece of that fit into the story.
You know what
was going on?
I would call. As a matter of fact, I was thinking about this specific game, this Call of Cthulhu game. I think a new term should be developed: a roleplay crawl, because that's what some of it felt like. Because we get to like a cabin in the woods, and it took us forever to even approach the cabin and look in the windows because we're so freaked out. And it slowed the game down tremendously. And I don't know that.
Yeah, I thought you guys would blow through that cabin scene in like 30 minutes, and I swear it was like one whole session. You guys,
let's be honest. Jimmy was so freaked out.
I was. Man.
I don't know, man.
Well, for the most part, I wasn't freaked out until Jimmy started freaking out, and I was like, "Oh yeah, he's got a point." A cabin in the woods. I didn't put that together. That is a trope.
Well, I think it's kind of the metagaming aspect of it. We've all seen,
The Evil Dead.
But that's okay.
Evil Dead, exactly.
But that's okay, because I set my Call of Cthulhu in modern times, and Jimmy came right out and said, "Hey, my character has seen The Evil Dead."
And he's not going to mess around with this crap. Yeah. So with the dungeon crawl stuff with Andrew, though, going back to that, one thing that fascinates me about it, just on a personal level, is that with a dungeon crawl, one of the reasons why it goes so slow is, or at least prior to Fantasy Grounds, is you have that take it one step at a time. Let's see, we pull out a piece of paper, draw the map, write down, okay, we add this, we subtract this, we got all this math we got to work through. It slows the game down to almost a stop in some cases if you're following the rules. Whereas with Fantasy Grounds, you eliminate all of that, which opens up a little bit more space so that you can do the storytelling aspect. You have more freedom to do that, and you get all this garbage stuff out of the way in terms of you don't have to deal with it, but it's still there and it gets calculated and applied correctly. That's amazing, and I've noticed that we can do more of that, lean it closer to role-playing instead of like a board game type of thing, because we got that time to sit there, and Steven is really good about coming up with wackadoodle sort of ideas that work, but man, they take the game
ish
unpredictable,
but they take the game in some very
ideas,
interesting,
for sure.
Yeah, interesting places. And I've noticed, like I don't know who said it, maybe it was Frank, that it gives us time for us to develop unique characters, rather than that's the wizard, that's the paladin, that's the cleric. Of course, who wants to be a cleric? Though I wish we had one.
I'm multi-classing one because nobody else was a cleric.
So that's Steven said that, and so let's get back to that point of the creativity. I think it's an interesting, again, another dimension in the creativity of being a character. And I want to tease back to the notion of, is there such a thing as a dungeon crawl if you're allowed the latitude to make an interesting character? And I'm going to bounce this specifically to Steven because he did raise the issue. How critical do you think that is to the notion of breaking out of a dungeon crawl? Is it everything, or is it?
It's half of everything, because it's either the ability to grow as a character or the malleability of the story itself to branch and to bring something more to it than it started with. So with Gauntlet, you are only fighting your way through a dungeon. And that's why I have trouble with the dungeon crawl definition and what they kind of lump into in Wikipedia and other things, because they do have stories that concentrate very much on your character growth within that system. And within those systems on the video game side, it's stats and abilities and equipment. And it's things that contribute to making your character more powerful or more useful. That's still growth. You don't get a lot of growth in a personality, but you do get some kind of growth that you get to tailor yourself. In Gauntlet, you get nothing. You get nothing. You go through the game, you have potions, you have food, pretty much. That is the simplest crawl that there is. These other adventures and branch it off to modules in Dungeons & Dragons, where you are trying to increase the level of your character. This module is for 1 to 5, this is 6 to 10, this is 11 to 15. And on each one, you are trying to grow in power so that you can specifically beat the next challenge, which 9 times out of 10 is an obstacle that includes a fight or a big bad. So the whole point of you going through these adventures is to grow in power to defeat something. So your ability to grow that character sideways into a unique personality becomes a little limited. And I think it was limited when we were starting out and we were playing these things, we were doing the modules, and in some cases, especially in mine in the beginning, in order to have a character that I felt had some kind of meat and a personality and a soul, I had to steal it from something else. So it became something from the start that was unique that I could imagine, because I wasn't getting that kind of growth in the soul of a character that I was playing. So now, as everything has progressed, video games have progressed, role-playing games that you do with pen and paper have progressed, there's been this push, I believe, among players and among the people who make the games to allow people to create their own characters that are either more representative of themselves or what they want to be. You know, if you look at it on the video game side, something like Skyrim, which gives you so many choices that you're able to go back through the game and replay it, taking a different path to see how your character grows, and the interactions that your character takes with people that affect how people look at your character, you know, what its reputation is, what kind of character it ultimately becomes. So I believe as all of this has progressed over the past 40 plus years, that we're getting in some ways away from the on rails, and we're trying more and more to give people the opportunity to grow within a character. Now, some people still like the on rails. I mean, the iPhone and Android are full of on rails dungeon crawls, side scrollers where it is just combat after combat after combat. But I think one of the reasons why Dungeons and Dragons is having a resurgence is because people are hungry for something that's more creative, and I think they're finally getting it. Now, I kind of went off target there a little bit.
No, I don't think so. I think it's redefining, and it raises one of the questions I want to talk about is as Steve-O started off telling us early on in the podcast, when it started, that's where we all started from, is a dungeon crawl type of history, if you will. And then, so what you're saying, Stephen, is I guess I'm asking is, based upon what you're saying, do we think dungeon crawls really exist anymore? At least in the context of pen and paper role playing. Obviously, video games are a different situation, but do they even exist anymore?
I think absolutely. I mean, maybe we're not drawing it out on graph paper because we have the electronics to show us. But another aspect, it occurred to me, and I had it on my back desk here, as one of my many visits to an out-of-town bookshop or a gaming shop, I picked up a Dungeons and Dragons Book of Challenges, Dungeon Rooms, Puzzles, and Traps. So I think this is one thing that I dislike about your typical dungeon crawl. To me, it always feels like the dungeon is created to be one big giant puzzle that doesn't really mean anything other than solving one puzzle. You walk into the room, there's a statue, and you describe the statue, and then, the players have to, fiddle around with it until something happens or nothing happens. But room to room puzzles or challenges doesn't really have any cohesiveness to it. They don't serve the story. To me, when I play a dungeon crawl type Dungeons and Dragons game, it just feels like I'm playing a game. It never feels like I'm role playing. You know what? Do you know where I'm going with that?
Oh, for sure.
It's like I don't want to just walk into a room and then, okay, I got to solve this one puzzle in this one room, and then kill whatever's here, and then I move to the next room for the next puzzle and the next group of creatures. I want everything to fit. I want there to be a reason that statue's there with some weird trap.
Yeah, it's more like a board game at that point rather than a role playing game.
I mean, that's just my... And again, that's why I'm not a massive fan of... I haven't played Dungeons & Dragons until we started back up with Andrew. Now, I've had a lot of fun because I'm a player. And, it's neat to play it and have a whole different perspective on it. But, there's that. To me, I feel like it's sort of limited. And again, because you have to level, I don't know. I don't know. It's just certain aspects of that game and the system and what's conducive to it that I prefer a more story-oriented type of role-playing game.
Well, I think Steven brought up something really interesting I hadn't thought about was, I think in those early days, like in the late 70s and the 80s, role-playing was so new that in order to get into it, you needed this bridge. So you had the board games or the tabletop war games that had been around for a while, those Napoleonic war games, and then that morphed into role-playing games. And to bridge that gap to get into role-playing, you would go into these dungeon crawl style games. But now you have this whole new generation where they have these elaborate video games, and role-playing has already found a really strong resurgence amongst this new group of people that I don't know that dungeon crawls really are as necessary as they used to be to go into.
And that's a good point, because actually when I first started, I didn't know there was anything different. I thought this is how you play Dungeons and Dragons. You draw a cave system, and everybody goes through it room to room, and you put puzzles and creatures there. And then it wasn't till later I was gaming with a guy who was a little bit older than me, and he had mentioned that he thought it would be neat to make a book-length adventure and that sort of thing. And then I started, just expanding my own games to include more story-oriented things until it's finally just morphed into, I rarely have just the combat heavy type encounters. It's usually a lot of interaction with NPCs, a lot of guesswork. You know, I feel like it keeps all the players really engaged. But now, again, if you like combat heavy and you want to have kind of a role-playing / war game experience where you're tactically setting your characters on a map or using miniatures, if that's your jam, man, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, if that's what's fun to you.
But it's more of a choice now, right, than it was before. Where before it was almost like a necessity in order to transverse the gap between role-playing and tabletop gaming.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas
Right.
now, maybe this new generation doesn't have at least a sense of that same constraint.
Well, I think it's safe to say that Dungeons and Dragons is still probably is played. You could probably combine all other role-playing games, and I would say that many more people are still playing Dungeons and Dragons on a regular basis compared to other role-playing games. I mean, that may be a stretch to say that. And actually,
No, I don't think so.
If any listeners are out there and you disagree with that, and give me a reason why, please send an email to roleplaygeeks@roleplaygeeks.com.
Yeah, I think that D&D is the Windows users of computers. I mean, yeah, there are other things out there, but
What's the Mac user?
Yeah, I'm like a Linux user with Traveler. or something even more obscure.
I want to jump to a point you made, and I'm going to jump away from it real quick because I just want to stick it out there. But you said you moved to other games that you thought were better for storytelling, and I've always found it kind of interesting that both yourself and to some extent Jimmy, not as much, but have suggested that Dungeons and Dragons is too limiting in what you can do or the types of stories you can tell. And I've always thought that was kind of interesting because I don't agree, obviously. I think that it's just a different genre. I don't think that Traveler is any more expansive, for example, in the stories that you can tell, or because the system imposes limitations that D&D, or it doesn't impose limitations that D&D imposes. So
Okay.
I thought, and again, I think it's an interesting topic maybe for another podcast, but
Well, I can answer it pretty quickly. I mean, you're right. I like Traveler because I like to read hard science fiction. So I like science fiction, again, hard sci-fi as opposed to fantasy. That's just what I like. So I'm attracted to that. But the other issue is, again, D&D feels like you're always trying to just get to that next level, right? And so when I was, like I'm a first level character, I have 8 hit points or whatever. And then, I've killed some stuff and now all of a sudden I got 16 hit points and then I'm fighting stronger creatures, but it's always feels kind of like the same game. I get more abilities as I go along, but then I'm level 10 all of a sudden, and then I've got a new guy that comes in, right? A new player is joining my group. Okay, what do I say? Roll up a 10th level character. The thing I like about Traveler and Call of Cthulhu and some of the other ones is that it can be a deadly game, and characters can die, and it doesn't feel as much as a tragedy as it does in D&D because you've played this character and built him, and developed him, maybe from level 1, and you've gained all these things, and then if you die in the game, most DMs are not going to say start all over, right? They're going to say, well, roll up a whatever level character, because he has to be able to hang with the rest of the group, because if he's a first level character and you're fighting 10th level stuff, you're not going to survive. Whereas a game like Traveler or Call of Cthulhu does not rely on character development. That has very little to do with it. In fact, Traveler has none other than my little system I created, and Call of Cthulhu has a pretty limited one. And so that way, if the 5 of us are playing, or you guys are all players, and Frank's character dies, or I should say Jimmy's character dies.
yeah, let's be honest, Jimmy.
Yeah. He can. I mean, in fact, we did that. His character got almost mortally wounded, and then I was able to,
dead.
Have a guy show up on a ATV and join the group and the posse or whatever.
Yeah, he ended up in the same condition too by the end of the game.
Yeah, that's true. But beyond that, I mean, my point of that is I can focus on, a story, and if characters die along the way, players can quickly roll up another character, and I can bring them in pretty fast, just like I brought in Ribs on my Traveler adventure,
not
right?
quickly
Right, Steve?
than Traveler. I think a way to look at it is when you play other game systems, when you roll up a character, they're already an adult. They already have skills, they have life experiences, they are a fully formed character. Whereas in D&D, you're basically
it's almost like you're rolling up a teenager.
No, you're like rolling up a 5-year-old.
You don't have to, though. I mean, you can roll up a 5th level character, 6th level character.
Yeah,
and jump
right, you can.
But then you roll up the 5th level character, and I think D&D is structured in such a way that you learn your spells, you learn your skills as you go. I mean, unless you just know the rule system real well. But
well, we're getting way off of track here, Frank.
Right.
But again, you asked the question of why I feel like it's not as conducive to at least my type of storytelling.
Well, I didn't necessarily ask the question. I just pushed back against it to lead to this question, which is what I really wanted to ask. Do you think the rule set of Dungeons and Dragons lends itself to dungeon crawl type of stories more so than some of these other rule sets like Call of Cthulhu or Traveler? If you think there's anything inherently, do dungeon crawls show up in D&D more than other type of systems?
If you play a bunch of modules, they're always going to show up because almost all the modules are that way. I mean, I love what we're doing on Fantasy Grounds and playing Dungeons and Dragons. I've been having a lot of fun, but you have to admit that entire module is designed just to be, a room-to-room challenge for the most part. I mean, I don't feel like there's a cohesive story there, and if it is, I'm just missing it out. I'm missing it. I don't get it.
Right.
So, Jimmy, you shook your head because clearly you disagree 100% with what I just said, using the head shake that you often use whenever you think I'm so far off base of reality that it's not even worth commenting. I'm going to ask you to comment.
Well, if the question is, do I think Dungeons and Dragons lends itself because of its rule set to a dungeon crawl, I don't know that's the reason why Dungeons and Dragons leads itself to a dungeon crawl. I think it's probably more of a historical kind of thing and a mindset. So if you have a Dungeons and Dragons player that moves over to Traveler, I suspect they'll do the same thing. Regardless of the rule set, they're going to do a dungeon crawl type of thing if that's where their mind's at. So I don't necessarily think it's the rule set that pushes you one way or the other. Because you could do it easily, a dungeon crawl easily in Traveler. And I've done that some.
Well, I mean, in Dungeons and Dragons, sure. I mean, a game master is free to create any kind of story they want.
Yeah.
I just think traditionally, I think that's where dungeon crawl came from, is that's the way the game's been played traditionally for many years.
Yeah.
Since its inception.
I would agree with you that to get back to the Fantasy Grounds campaign we were running, I would agree with you that if I were going to define dungeon crawl, I would say that would be a dungeon crawl. That has all the hallmarks of a dungeon crawl. But I think it's very interesting that Steven defined dungeon crawl in such a way that he basically said the thing that we've been going through in Andrew's campaign is not a dungeon crawl. And he actually did make me rethink that going into this podcast, I was like, yeah, this is a perfect example of a dungeon crawl. That is the dungeon crawl typical period. But Steven actually redefined dungeon crawl such that if you have character growth, which is, I think, if you knew him really well, you would know that is very central to Steven's personality of character and the development therein, and the type of person you are, whether that be in a fantasy setting or in reality. I think that is an interesting take on dungeon crawl that it just simply hadn't occurred to me. What do you guys think about that point he made?
I find dungeon crawls kind of, I don't think they're all that great. I think they're really good for getting into a system and getting people that have never played into how to handle a character or how to role play, how to use the dice, how some of the mapping works, the terms, the lexicon you have to build up. Get someone into role playing. I think it's a wonderful way to get it. And the kind of camaraderie and working together as characters, like, okay, well, I'll be the meat shield, you're going to heal me, the elf is, or the rogue over there is going to pick the locks and find the traps, blah blah blah. I think it's a great way to kind of get someone into role playing without just dumping them in the deep end like Traveler might do, where they just would flail around and die. So I think it works.
And that's just rolling up the character.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
But the thing is, I think that what we're doing with in Andrew's thing is definitely a dungeon crawl. Now, I mean, I'm enjoying it because I'm getting to play with my friends, and it's awesome. It's really fun and stuff. But in and of itself, I find dungeon crawls just kind of crap overall. Because there is no real character growth. You're not actually doing anything. You're not really interacting with characters per se. Like, I've brought this up before in a previous one, but when we did when Frank ran a D&D one, he had this whole background about these two warring nations, and we were set on a quest to kind of, I forgot exactly the details and stuff, but we were to help broker a peace, I believe it was, because there were some things that were kind of wonky going on, but there was a lot to it. Now, admittedly, we ended up having combat because we were being pursued kind of by both sides to some extent, and there was a lot of stuff that was going on, but it was more interactive, and it wasn't just, oh, I will shoot an arrow, or I will swing my sword, or I will cast magic missile. It wasn't just these. Well, I mean, because really, a dungeon crawl, especially what we've been playing in Fantasy Grounds, feels just like playing Neverwinter Nights on my PC. Very much the same thing, except we have to do a little bit more, of, this thing doesn't automatically do this here, so I've got to click on the, okay, now it does it. I mean, it feels very much more like that, with Andrew actually describing rooms and stuff instead of, going, having brilliant artwork that kind of describes itself. And again, I'm having fun playing it, and I'm not saying that dungeon crawls can't be fun and enjoyable, because they definitely can. When I first started role playing with Frank, I had role played with Steve-O initially, and so I wanted to get Frank into it so we could play. And we played, I'm pretty sure it was Keep on the Borderland. But
of course it was.
But because that's what I had. I had the box set.
That's all there is.
Exactly, that's all there was. But what it amounted to, though, was that I didn't have, for one thing, what I recall going over it and stuff, was that Frank really didn't understand. Because the thing is, your initial.
Let's be honest, anything.
Because I didn't understand it very well, because I'd only role played a little bit, and so getting to the point where you kind of are getting what's going on and how to kind of create this whole milieu of wonder and things to do and adventure. So we just kind of went, okay, so there's some caves that you've been sent out to go investigate. And you got your trusty sword, and I don't remember, did you play a dwarf or something like that? I forgot what it was.
Yeah, so I had a crossbow, and I didn't know what that was, and a sword and a shield, and I was a dwarf.
Right. And so we did the whole thing and stuff, and as we kind of got more into it and stuff, I don't remember exactly where we went once we finished. I think the next one we did, I did something kind of similar.
I think it's a little bit like, what's the second video that played after Video Killed the Radio Star on MTV? Like, nobody remembers what that is, but everybody remembers the first one.
Right.
So I was just thinking about what you were saying previously, and really the way Stephen articulated, I think, is right, at least from my perspective. So historically speaking, for me, dungeon crawls where you didn't get to develop your character, and it was really just more like playing a board game from my perspective. Whereas with Andrew and what we're doing in Fantasy Grounds, that open space that you get because you don't have to deal with the rules does give you the ability to develop your character more, at least from my perspective. And in this game, well, John's right. I mean, there are lots of aspects of it that feel like a Neverwinter Nights game. There's still room in there where I feel like we are developing little bits of story here and there. I mean, the there's the instance with the flaming skull where there's a little bit of a story that gets revealed in there, and then
I thought about
there's
that.
a
That was
story
pretty funny.
then there's a story that develops from that, because we're not spending all of our time doing the math and doing all of the grunt work, both the game master and the players having to do that. It's taken off the board, and you don't have to deal with it, so you do have room to grow a little bit more.
Then we are making choices beyond
Right.
what you can do in a video game.
And the other thing that Fantasy Grounds, I think, lends itself to be used as is a way for people who do more of the role-playing and then trickle in some dungeon crawls from time to time or some combat. If you used it only for those aspects, it would speed those up and make a very interesting. That's what I'm interested in doing, is going ahead and playing role-playing like we normally do, and then when you have combat or you have a little place you have to explore, bring Fantasy Grounds in at that point, and that's going to speed that part up and keep the pace up, make the game more enjoyable. And I'm really interested in using Fantasy Grounds from that perspective.
That's assuming you become as proficient as Andrew is.
Well, there is the learning curve for sure.
Okay, so we've talked a bit about dungeon crawls, and it's obviously the place that where most of us older school gamers have started, and maybe we've come to the conclusion that newer gamers now that are just starting out on their journey, maybe they're not starting there. Maybe they're doing something a little more nuanced, and that's kind of cool. I think dungeon crawls can ultimately be a little bit like a bag of Oreos, which is a very familiar artifact within most gaming circles. It can be a very good comfort food, and it's not a good full meal, but they have their place, and sometimes they're enjoyable. If you've got any thoughts about dungeon crawls, you can of course reach us at the contact information coming here in a minute.
That's all we have for this week. Thanks for spending time with us. Please leave a review and comments wherever you listen. It helps others find the show. If you have topic suggestions or would like to get in touch, you can reach us at Roleplay Geeks at roleplaygeeks.com. Head on over to the website for an archive of all our previous shows, as well as links to all our social media channels. Thanks again, and we'll catch you next week.